Welcome to September 16th edition, 2021 of I Was Just Thinking. I'm travel journalist Rudy Maxa, and if you're new to this webcast, or if you're watching this on YouTube or on Facebook, every 2 weeks, I endeavor to interview somebody interesting in the world of travel, of either perhaps an author or someone who's traveled widely, or an adventure traveler, anything has to do with travel. And I'm so delighted to have a terrific guest today. But first, let me tell you, we do this every 2 weeks. And if you are watching this on the 17th, I will say blessings to you, if Yom Kippur, if you're celebrating that. Otherwise, if you're watching this a little later, just keep in mind, this is September 16th of 2021. So we're still in a COVID situation. We may make some references to that, talking to our guest. My guest is named Lindsay Miller, and she has a new book out called North Korea, subtitled Like Nowhere Else. And that's certainly an appropriate subtitle. In the very first sentence of her introduction to her new book, Lindsay Miller asks, "How much can you really know about a place?" Unquote. In her case, it's a really good question, especially if the place you're talking about is the very closed country of North Korea. Until 2019, hi, Lindsay. Welcome to the big show.
Thanks for having me.
We are reaching her in Taipei. I'll tell you about that in just a moment. Until 2019, Lindsay Miller lived 2 years in Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. Her husband was posted there as a British diplomat. She is from Glasgow, Scotland. You'll hear it in her accent, though she and her husband currently live in Taipei, the capital of Taiwan, and we're reaching her today in Taipei. Lindsay's a musical director and an award-winning composer, but while in North Korea, she roamed the capital and the surrounding countryside with a camera and produced this book that is as much a picture book, a photo book, as it is a narrative. One housekeeping note, because of the 13-hour time difference between where I am in St. Paul, Minnesota, and where Lindsay is in Taipei, we're actually recording this the day before. So we will not be able to take viewer questions, I'm sorry, today, but I think the topic is so rich and so interesting that you won't miss it at all. Welcome to the show, Lindsay. In the introduction to your book, let me read it to you. Quote, "What happens when you go somewhere when even basic truths are ambiguous, where sometimes you can't trust your own eyes or even what you feel, where the divide between real and imagined is never clear," unquote. Now, you write that you were tormented by those questions the entire 2 years you lived in North Korea. And I know this is a big question, but what do you mean when you say you couldn't even trust your own eyes or what you feel?
So I think when you visit anywhere in the world, you already go someplace with expectations and assumptions about that place based on your own research. So as any curious person would, when going anywhere, I would read books, watch documentaries, and that was the case with North Korea as well. As we all know, North Korea features heavily in the news. It is at the moment for the behavior of the regime and its missile launches and so on. And the image that we're presented with, because it's so current and appropriate at the time, is of parades, the regime's propaganda, and takes as well from our side, from the West, of talking heads discussing what that could mean politically on the Korean Peninsula and what the implications are of North Korea's behavior in the rest of the world. And so for me, those were the images I had in my head before I went to North Korea. When I arrived there, I very quickly realized that those views were oversimplistic, and of course didn't explain every tiny little thing I was seeing, because actually what I was seeing was the everyday lives of people, a certain layer of everyday life of people who were just trying to get on with their day, go to work, drop their kids off at school, go out to the park for a picnic on the weekends. And so all of those things are not the things we automatically think of when we think of North Korea, because we are so focused on the regime. And as I mentioned, it's in the book, it's right to do so, to focus on the regime to a certain extent, because it is important. But at the same time, we tend to forget the everyday people that live there. And so that's why that question was so prominent in my mind the entire time. There's also a layer of life there, which I knew was there, but I couldn't see and I couldn't ask about. So from reading defectors' testimonies, and there are so many amazing books and stories out there, talk about the conditions and suppression under which North Koreans live. And I was very aware of that, but I couldn't always see it. I could sometimes see or talk about those subtleties. And that really got into my head and really affected me a lot, because especially with my friends, there was so much I wanted to know about their lives and learn about them as they probably wanted to learn about me, and so many things that they were suffering from that I couldn't ask them about.
Well, we'll talk about that inability to pierce the fabric of everyday society of the people the North Koreans you were around during the course of our chat. But let's start with where you lived. Was it? I know it was was it a diplomatic neighborhood, or was it more of a compound?
So it's kind of a bit of both. Unlike other cities in the world where you can live wherever you like most of the time, in Pyongyang it's slightly different. So foreigners are contained to certain parts of the city. For me, I lived in the Munsu-dong area, which is a district in the east of Pyongyang. And a lot of foreign embassies, aid organizations, charities, and so on were based in that part of the city, within a compound, within a larger compound. And it was secured by soldiers who stood on the edges, on the border of that area. And any Koreans that came in and out of that area were demanded for ID and had to have some reason to be there.
Was it walled, or were there trees? Were there flowers? Was it a happy place? Was it fairly stark? Were the buildings built by foreigners, or are these North Korean style buildings? Were they modern? How did the water work? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's very basic. It's certainly not the more kind of modern apartments that you see in the rest of Pyongyang. In terms of the British compound, we were behind, the accommodation blocks are often behind the embassy itself. So for us, we were living in, kind of basic apartments, about a 20-second walk from the embassy, along with the Germans and Swedish. There were also, the Iranians were in that compound further along, the French were there, etc., etc. So lots and lots of different people. It was very leafy. There were lots of trees. As you mentioned, with flowers, there were lots of persimmon trees and other fruit trees that would drop fruit in the fall. And it was actually surrounded by a lot of North Korean apartment blocks where North Koreans lived. And it was often used as a shortcut for North Korean school children and others to cut through to get from one side of the city to the other, which I always thought was quite interesting, seeing as it was such a tightly controlled area. And there were kids' play parks and things like that in there as well. So it certainly wasn't dingy or anything like that. It was just kind of like a little kind of mini village.
How was the water pressure in your apartment? How did the air conditioning work?
The air conditioning did work. That was always something I thought about, because aircon is a luxury there. So the fact we even had it was really nice. The problems there were always when things didn't work. It was always a much bigger issue, because you wouldn't necessarily have people within North Korea who could fix it and who were efficient at fixing it. So sometimes you would have to live with things for a long time that didn't work. But in the grand scheme of things, that really wasn't very important.
You said there were guards at entrances. Were there multiple entrances to this neighborhood on streets? Was there a guard posted at each place?
So there was one soldier who, it would rotate who it was, but there would be one soldier stationed at the sole entrance to the compound by road. And they had, as I write about in the book, a large red telephone. And they would have a little hut as well. They would stand inside at night. And there was a huge floodlight. And basically their job was to pick up the phone, and whenever you left the compound, to call in. We all thought maybe it was the number plates that they were probably calling in to let someone know of who was leaving and who was coming back.
Well, there were other posts 300 meters away, and they would get a call from your guy on the red phone saying, "Here comes Lindsay Miller," or "Here comes car XYZ." And then when you passed there, they would call and say to another post. It was you said you felt you were being tracked most of the time.
Yeah, exactly. So as you say, there were soldiers along outside each embassy or organization, and they would all pick up the phone, and it would sort of be a domino effect every time you would leave and every time you would come back. And yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I chose the title North Korea Like Nowhere Else, because I had never experienced being watched in that way before, and I'd never experienced having so many eyes on me and experiencing freedoms like anonymity, for example, just being able to walk down the street and no one pay attention to me. I never appreciated how powerful a thing, powerful a feeling that is until I was there. And yeah, we were made to feel watched. As I also write about in the book, there's several examples where I was in a restaurant, for instance, and I was talking to my friend, and I was next to a windowsill with some plastic flowers on it, and my friend and I were just talking, and we heard a phone ring, and I said, "Oh, that must be you," and they said, "Oh no, that must be you," and it was neither of our phones, but it was coming from the flowers on the windowsill, and a waitress came running over, and we were the only people in that restaurant. The waitress came running over and picked up the flowers, and there was a phone underneath which had been recording what we'd been saying, and she just quite openly answered the call, said hello, said I'll need to call you back later, hung up, put the recording thing back on, and slipped it back under the flowers, and just walked away as if nothing had happened. We ate our meal, we paid up, and she was very friendly, and that was that. And so there was a lot of these kind of instances where you know, and that's an example of when it's obvious. There were I'm guessing a lot of instances where it wouldn't have been obvious, and that was also something I found myself thinking about a lot.
There must be an enormous bureaucracy. I mean, somebody had to be listening or recording, or I mean, there must be somebody writing all this stuff down somewhere. You know, when you leave in a car, and where you're going, and you know what you said at lunch with your friend. There must be this enormous bureaucracy that's keeping track of not just foreigners, diplomats, but I'm sure some locals who they might be keeping an eye on for various reasons.
Oh, completely. And I think a lot of us within the foreign community, we talk about that a lot, and how probably the amount of eyes that were on all of us probably was just as much to do with keeping an eye on the local North Korean people who we were speaking to, and those who we weren't speaking to as well, to keep an eye on them as well. So that web of control just goes so far, and when you see it coming to the surface, it really is quite disorienting, and really does throw you.
I remember when the United States was building a new embassy in Moscow, and I don't know, they were pretty much done with. I mean, they'd gotten the superstructure up. It was a high rise, I think, and they discovered the walls were riddled with bugs. Was your compound ever swept, or do you ever feel you were listened to in the privacy of your home?
I mean, again, like within the foreign community, all of us spoke about that frequently, and you know, from reading defectors' testimonies and experiences they've had, you know, of talking about them being listened to or tracked in some way, I think it's probably safe to assume there was something like that. I mean, even with our mobile phones, we had two separate networks for cell phones, and foreigners could only contact each other. North Korean people could only contact each other. So if you wanted to contact a local North Korean person, you couldn't do that. It physically wouldn't connect. So you were kept completely separate. And the only way of contacting local people was via your interpreter, who had two phones. So you would have to call them if you wanted to have a taekwondo lesson, for example, or go to a language lesson or whatever. And then they would then call the relevant North Korean person to organize that, and then call you back. So even in that example, you see openly the filtration of information from you to them. So from the cell phones, as I say, I think it's safe to assume there's probably other things going on there
all
as
the
well.
foreigners on a special particular cell phone company's phones makes it a little easier to track calls and record and so on. You said that if you wanted to book a taxi or go on the metro, you had to go with an authorized Korean official, usually a translator, but you were forbidden to ride on buses. Was that a translator, a helper, a watcher? And why weren't you allowed on buses?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And again, we all ask that, why are we not allowed? I think personally, my theory is that when you're on a bus or when you're on the subway or in a taxi, you're around local people in a way that can't be monitored necessarily. So if you're in a taxi, you're one-to-one with a North Korean person, and that then you being there then puts that person at risk. They could say something to you, they could ask you something, because I really do think a lot of it is more about controlling them in a lot of ways, that than just about foreigners.
Sure.
And so, I mean, there were stories of foreigners who had taken taxis through organising with their interpreter. You couldn't flag them down on the street; they would never stop. And there were always stories as well of people who had taken buses. And this was something that was interesting, was trying to find what are the rules. How far can you push it, but not be not put anyone at risk, not put yourself at risk, and still explore the place and have a wholesome experience. So it was always trying to find where that line was.
Well, it's interesting that you say not only might you being watched, but anybody, a North Korean who had spent a lot of time talking to you on the street could be suspect. Why were you talking to her? What did she say? What did you say? My guest is Lindsay Miller. She has a new book out called North Korea. It's called North Korea Like Nothing Else. And it draws on her 2 years of experience until 2019, living with her husband, who is a British diplomat in Pyongyang, Pyongyang, did I just pronounce that right? In the capital of North Korea. She took a lot of pictures. She has a camera. I like this one picture, number one, Tommy, the couple walking in front of that big building. It just looks so lonely. And what is that building?
So that building is the Rodong Shinmun, which is the state North Korean newspaper. So when you often see on our side of the pond of the media reporting, like for example the recent missile test, they'll be announced within state media, and the Rodong Shinmun is one of those arms of the regime to announce those tests and other things going on in the country. And what I find really interesting about this photograph is firstly that there's a couple holding hands. I hadn't expected when I went to North Korea for
Right.
public displays of affection like holding hands to be accepted, but it was really common. And for that to be happening with a young couple in front of a building that represents such a strong arm of the regime and its message and what it's trying to put out there, I think shows that our view of North Korea can sometimes be that it doesn't change, it's not changing in any way whatsoever, and it refuses to change. But actually, I think there are very, very small changes that just happen over a much longer period of time than what we are used to. And this is an example of that.
And I see in the front of the building, there's a picture of Dear Leader, I presume. And those are everywhere, right? I mean, does every home have a picture of Dear Leader and perhaps his father? I don't know who the other person is.
Yeah, that's right. So on the left there, you've got Kim Il-sung, who was the first North Korean leader. And then to his right, you have Kim Jong-il, who was his son, the second North Korean leader. So the current leader's father and grandfather. And every official building in North Korea will have those outside the front of its doors, and also within homes as well. Every home is required to have both of those portraits. I might be wrong, but I think it's on the right hand side wall as soon as you come into a room, and they're in gold frames, and you can see them when you drive through Pyongyang or you walk through other towns as well at night. Particularly, you can see lights from inside people's homes, and you can see those portraits on the wall.
And you never could go inside a North Korean's home. You weren't allowed to do that, were you?
No, we weren't, and that was something. Again, there's
no one could invite
things.
you to dinner. No one could say, "Hey, Lindsay, why don't you and your husband come over and have a little bok choy or whatever?"
No, you couldn't do that. A lot of the North Koreans I managed to build relationships with were people who worked in bars or restaurants already, and I went there and therefore spent time there and spoke to them. But I had a few instances where I'd met some North Korean people. We got on really well. And in any normal situation, I would say, here's my number, let's go for coffee, let's go for some lunch, and I'd love you to meet, my husband, I'd love to meet your family. But you couldn't do that. Firstly, there's the cell phone issues we've just discussed.
Right.
And as you say, secondly, you can't go into anyone's home. It's a natural thing when you meet someone, oh, come round to my house, I'll cook you some food, and I'd love to get to know you better. But that just wasn't possible there. The only, as far as we could go, was just seeing homes from the outside. But that's why I liked the evenings. I liked walking around the city in the evening and the lights being on in people's homes, and just seeing people cook their dinner, just watching TV, singing karaoke or reading a book, just enjoying normal everyday life within those four walls that you couldn't go into.
Tommy, can we put up the number 6, the pictures of the guys playing? And I don't think they're playing chess, but they're playing some kind of game in the park. What's going on there, Lindsay?
So you see that this is quite a common sight all over Pyongyang and other cities as well in North Korea, where you get groups of men. Sometimes they're retired, and they're playing different games. This is Korean chess that they're playing,
Oh, it is.
and there were different groups of men were crowded round, and lots of spectators gather round and cheer on their favorite players, and there's lots of shouting and cheering on whoever it is they want to win. And this would be a really, really common sight. Other things retired men like to do, in particular, fishing as well, and reading the newspaper. So this is one of the common activities you would see around the place.
The locals like to photograph you, you said. I guess they don't see a lot of foreigners. But sometimes a man in a suit would appear with a camera to take a picture of the person taking a picture of you. And that certainly caused people to shrink into the shadows and put down their camera, I guess. You talked about walking around town. You do say in your book that no one ever stopped you, except at a military parade, from ever taking a photograph. Nobody tried to grab your camera, so you have to delete that photo. But while you were doing this walking around at night, as you said, sort of seeing with some difficulty through people's windows, did you always feel there was someone following you or tracking you, or not always?
I didn't always feel that there was someone. A lot of the time, it was me wrestling with the thought that, am I buying into the mythology of North Korea, which is everyone is watched all of the time? Is that me buying into it and putting my views onto the situation? Or is this woman who's gardening in this park just a gardener who's gardening
and not taking notes on you, right?
And not taking notes. Because I think it's impossible to live your life every single minute of the day and every tiny thing to be watched and reported. I mean, there are a lot of people in Pyongyang, but there are also the people who live there also thinking about their situation rather than yours. While you mentioned a man in a suit showing up, that was at a water park, and I'd had a really lovely experience with a North Korean man who introduced me to his baby granddaughter, and he'd handed me her, and we had a very, with my very limited Korean, had a little conversation, and within a couple of moments, a man in a suit had come into the water park, and I thought, oh, that's a bit strange because everyone's in flip-flops and the rubber rings, swimwear and all kinds of things. And he sat at a table near me, and very quickly the grandfather sort of said that, give me her back, and took her away, and that was the end of that conversation. Right. So I think it would be naive to assume that there's none of that going on, and that wasn't in some way signaling to those people, stay away, just watch what you're saying, watch what you're doing. But at the same time, could have been a guy having a glass of water. I don't know.
Well, am I too cynical to think that management, which is to say the government of North Korea, wouldn't mind at all if you thought you were being watched at all times?
Oh, completely. I think it was, we were made to feel watched, and when
in the flower pot, I mean, that's hardly 007 discretion.
Oh, completely. And I think it's very openly, you are made to feel watched, and when you're made to feel watched, you do behave differently. You think about, you second guess everything.
Right.
Saying hello to someone, to going into a shop, when you get turned away. I mean, we would get turned away from restaurants and things sometimes.
Let's talk about that. You went into restaurants that didn't say private, they were open, people were in there. And to say you were given the cold shoulder is an understatement. You were escorted out angrily more than once. What was that about?
Yeah, I mean, I will never know the exact reason, but there would be restaurants I would go to where I'd been before, and then one day I would go there, and all of a sudden I'd be told that they were closed, and there were clearly people inside the restaurant, and I would say, but there are people like you're open, and they would say no, 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 close, and they would kind of like, there was never, I mean, a couple of occasions, one I write in the book, it was quite a cold, icy exchange, and the woman was obviously worried, and that made me worried for her, that I put her into that situation by being there, and so I didn't want her to get into any trouble for me being there, so I agreed with her and left. But sometimes it would be in a friendly way. It would be, no, we're closed, thank you very much, come back again, off you go. So it just depended.
It's so interesting that that not only do you have to worry about yourself and whether you were doing something wrong and whether you were going to get in trouble, but you had to worry about the North Korean you were having an exchange with, or talking to, or looking to, or standing next to, or whatever, whether they were going to get in trouble. And when I go to France and a baker says we're out of bread, I don't worry about him. I just irritated I can't get any bread, but he's out of bread. I don't think about the other person the way you clearly had to all the time, around every waking hour.
Oh, completely.
You get too friendly with the gardener, too intimate with the housekeeper, that sort of thing.
Completely. And there's this elephant in the room all of the time.
Right.
And you really want to be sensitive to that person. And it's really hard. You're trying to get to know someone. You want to be able to ask them questions about their family. You want to ask them questions about what their opinions are about certain things. I did have conversations with North Koreans about politics, but not all of the time, because I wouldn't, if I'm getting to know someone and if they were speaking to me, I wouldn't expect to be asked about my political views all of the time, when someone's getting to know me. So I kind of didn't really go in too much depth about that, and wanted to try and build some kind of trust with the North Korean people I was trying to build relationships with. But yeah, you do have to think about it all the time. It can, if you go too far, you can completely shut down a really lovely interaction with someone. And as you say, like, put somebody at risk. And I would never want to ever do that. So it was always kind of trying to find the balance of, how do I get to know this person? How do I balance that natural curiosity with preserving the safety of someone at the same time?
You mentioned the elderly gentleman, the grandfather, it sounds like, who handed you his baby to hold. Tommy, number 7, we have a picture of that beach scene. I don't know if this was that time, but it's sort of an interesting, if you look at the bathing suits on the women, they're quite conservative, shall we say. I don't see a lot of bikinis there, Lindsay.
Yeah, I was definitely the only one wearing a bikini on that beach, and felt very uncomfortable for being the odd one out. This photograph was taken in Nampo, which is a coastal town in North Korea, and known as one of the kind of major shipping points as well for the country. And this was taken on a summer's day. And as you can see in the center of the photo, there's a father handing his child some snacks. And all around them, there are people shouting, there are people cooking barbecue. You can kind of see some metal poles and sort of tent threads coming down. And these were marquees, which were, if you imagine, like 360-degree marquees from where this was taken. And there were people singing karaoke. There were, at least 10 different karaoke machines playing different songs, and people singing, people cooking barbecue, eating seafood, smoking, drinking.
Is the beach as crowded as it looks, or is that just a crowded section?
Oh yeah, I mean, the beach is crowded. There's some pictures in the book as well of people swimming in the sea, and it's packed with people. The beach itself in this particular area is reasonably small, but around the side you can see the sort of step up. There's a sandbank that's been built to wrap around the beach, and that's where everyone eats. And I actually took this from a restaurant which is above the changing rooms on the beach. So yeah, it was really, really busy, really busy.
Let's talk about the political system, Kim Jong-un's system. You called using myths as a powerful tool of survival. One of those being just, an endless claim of victimization by the West. The West is going to conquer us. The United States could attack at any moment. South Korea is coming over the border at any moment. Is that what all the big propaganda signs are, that we see pictures of in the West, with soldiers with bayonets and big red and yellow signs everywhere, and people look like demons who aren't Asian? And is that the myth? Is that how leadership, one-way leadership, hopes to stay in power, is by this feeling that we're all besieged all the time, so we got to stick together, and thank goodness we have a strong army and leaders here who have missiles that can fly all over the place?
Yeah, I definitely think that's part of it. North Korea's Juche ideology is about self-reliance, and so it is completely powered by its own belief system and its own economy and military and leadership, and those things help it survive. That is very central to its ideology. The defense, that view that they are there to defend themselves from attacks from the West is a very real one. And from speaking to North Korean people myself, that was something that came up a lot, and particularly at that time, we were there from 2017 to 2019, and 2017 was a really tense year for North Korea and relations with the US. And at that time,
the missiles started flying, right?
Yeah, there were a lot of missile tests. There was a nuclear test as well. That was when the ICBM that they had built was launched, that was capable of hitting the United States. And at that time, there was then a war of words between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, exchanging words of which felt like words of war. And it really did feel like that way on the ground. Fire and fury. I was there in my apartment watching that on the news, albeit not North Korean news, international news. And I was watching that, and Pyongyang felt very different at that time. But that sense of North Korea trying to defend itself had always been part of the narrative from any North Korean I'd spoken to. And the strange thing was that over the amount of time I was there, my psychology, I don't know if it was as a result of living it. I mean, it must have been from living in that environment for so long. But I started to think, oh, maybe they've got a point. Maybe they've got a point. And I certainly don't feel that way. But at the time, just the way my head was turning and questioning everything, and it was really having an effect on me, where actually my mind started to turn a little bit and go, well, maybe I can kind of understand where they're coming from, which is really interesting. And I think I think I had it myself, this overly simplistic view that all North Koreans think one way, and they really don't. But it'd be really fascinating to know how much that environment really does feed into people's minds, and how much you can battle that, because I found it really difficult.
My guest is author Lindsay Miller. Actually, she's a musician. How would you describe yourself when it comes to music? You write music, I know that.
I do, yeah. I always say I'm a musician. I'm kind of, as a music director, I kind of do lots of different things. I usually say I'm the bossy one in the room that makes lots of noise. So, okay.
For our purposes, she is an author and a photographer. Her new book is called North Korea Like Nowhere Else. It's just come out, and we're talking with her about that now. 2 years of living in the world's most secretive state. So 2017, the missiles start flying. Trump and Kim Jong-un are both being tough guys and making threats and so on, and people are tense. And then comes 2018, and was that when the Winter Olympics were in South Korea? And suddenly things turn a little it's sort of almost a love fest. I remember Donald Trump in the White House pulling out an envelope saying he just got basically a love letter from Kim Jong-un, and they're going to meet, and they really get along well, and they're going to be able to solve this whole thing. And you said, and also the North Korea was invited to the Winter Olympics in South Korea, even though apparently the Olympian Association had to pay for everything and had to sort of give a wild card to a lot of their athletes so they can at least post and be there. The idea was, let's see, I wrote what you put, how you put it. You said, the International Olympic Committee paid for everything, and athletes were given a wild card just so it could be shown they participated. The whole thing was rigged so North Korea would get applause just for showing up. But what was interesting to me is you said sort of the billboards around town, the broadcasts, the marching songs were all sort of dimmed down. And there was some sort of hope that maybe, and then Kim Jong-un left the country for the first time, took his private bomb-proof train car to China, and the news had him stepping off there to applause and flowers, head of state of China or somebody in China. And so there was a feeling there for a while of glasnost, or the North Korean version of it, right?
Oh, completely. I don't think even the North Koreans would have seen that coming. It was so at the opposite end of the scale from the tension and where we'd been in 2017. What I remember standing next to some North Korean friends watching Kim Jong-un get off the train in China. He was meeting Xi Jinping, and it was his first trip, I think, outside of North Korea. And I was watching it on state TV with my North Korean friends days after it happened. So I already knew that he'd been there, because there's usually a delay. But watching them, I mean, they genuinely were so excited, jumping up and down, texting their friends, texting their parents. Have you seen this? Have you seen this? They couldn't believe it. It was like watching a celebrity, completely blew their minds. And following the Winter Olympics, that was the start of that journey to President Trump stepping over the demarcation line into the north for Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in to shake hands and jump into each other's side of the DMZ. So it was a completely crazy change from what we'd seen.
And the messaging changed. The propaganda in North Korea reflected this thaw.
Completely. I mean, I bought some posters when I was there that had the iron fist, through the White House, and it seems like those didn't come back, after those went. They had big images of when North Korea and South Korea competed together at the Pyeongchang Olympics. They had a United Korea flag, which was in blue, the peninsula in blue, and that was seen all over Pyongyang. That was draped outside of the theater. It was draped outside of official buildings. There were people wearing United Korea T-shirts, and there was a slogan that was used as well a lot during 2018 called "Uri Hana," which means "We are one," and that was a really powerful slogan. And again, North Korean friends of mine were so taken with that message. Some had said to me they believed that there would be reunification in the future, not in their lifetime, but they believed it would happen someday. Others felt so inspired and really moved by it. It completely changed everything, and the parades and things that we'd seen before. I'd seen a rally in the square, which I write about in the book, and I'd watched so many people throwing their fists in the air and chanting, anti-US, anti-South Korean slogans and so on. And that didn't happen, not that I saw anyway. It felt very light. And that was the interesting thing about being there. It wasn't just seeing it, it was feeling what it was like. And it was so different.
That country's really good at parades and groups getting together, isn't it? We have a picture, one of the great pictures of this is amazing. This is, it's a Super Bowl show gone nuts, basically. They're really good at that. And you said just walking around, suddenly there'd be this spontaneous group of people chanting something. Clearly it's organized, but it sort of looks like we all just got together and all agreed on everything. And let's all chant these slogans as we march through town. Am I portraying that correctly? Oh, wait a minute. Before you answer that, let me add this. You said housewives would come out in the morning, no matter whether it was bitter winter or blazing summer, to sing and dance to commuters going to work in the morning. What's with that?
Yeah, so all over the city in the mornings, you'd have these groups of women who I was told were from different districts, and they were housewives, and they would sew costumes and rehearse singing and dancing. Sometimes they'd have drums, and they would have placards and signs that they would place around them, and they would dance and sing, and their role was to inspire the workers as they were making their way to work.
Right.
And they were amazing, and they would dance with small flags. It was almost quite like gymnastics in a way, and they were amazing. And they'd be there every single day. And I have to say, winter could get down to about -16, and they were still there.
Do you think they all got together and thought this would be a fun, great idea? Or is there somebody suggesting it'd be really good for you to do this?
I mean, that's the thing. I think at the root of everything, there is someone having organized it somewhere. You know, people in North Korea are mobilized frequently by the regime for various reasons. It could to construct something, or whether it's in this form, which is to go out and sing and dance for people. But that's not to say that there aren't women who take part in that who they may genuinely enjoy doing it. Maybe they like singing, maybe they like dancing. And again, this is something I question in the book. You know, we assume everyone in that group must be forced to sing and dance. Okay, they probably have been told that they need to, but that doesn't mean every single person, every single minute of the day is resenting doing it. Maybe there's something in it where they do enjoy it a little bit, or maybe they do genuinely hate it and they don't want to be there. But human beings can't be, we can't all be put in the same pigeonhole. There's such a variety of experiences there, and North Korean people need to be treated like that as well, where there is a variety of experiences. It's important we listen to all of them. As for the groups rehearsing, you know, this photograph is from the mass games, and that was in 2018, I think that one was from. And that the only thing I can compare that to is like going to an Olympic opening ceremony. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. Everyone is singing. At the back there in this photograph, you can see sort of little squares. It's almost pixelated, and these are all individual people holding cards.
And yeah, placards, right?
It's amazing. And on the different beats of the music, they would turn them over or swap them over, and the entire backdrop of the Mayday Stadium where this took place would be like one giant mosaic, and it would move as well. You'd see moving images, people dancing, and it was all done through flipping cards. You would see groups and like the women dancing at the front there were children involved in that, and we do know from various reports that children are forced to take part and have to work very, very long hours in very stressful circumstances and are physically exhausted by the amount of time that they're forced to commit to doing this.
The logistics must be incredible.
I mean, there are thousands and thousands of people that take part in this, and you can see them for months and months rehearsing around the city. So you would drive or walk through Pyongyang, and you would see groups. The same for parades in the square. You see groups rehearsing. They're dancing sometimes with props like these fans or hula hoops. Sometimes they wouldn't have those. It would just be to practice steps. But because in Pyongyang there are so many wide open spaces where you can practice these kinds of things, you would see people rehearsing, which I always found more interesting in a lot of ways than watching the performance itself, because I've seen these people down by the park rehearsing their dancing and so on.
Do you think they're paid to do this?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, no one is paid.
This is just for the glory of the state, right?
Oh, completely. And it's probably a very high honor to take part in it as well. Right. And there are people brought in from provinces all over the place. It's not just people from Pyongyang that take part in the mass games. There are also people from different districts and different suburbs and different areas that are brought in to participate.
One of the things that I think is true, because, and you correct me if you think it's a legend, is that the elite live very, very well. I mean, I saw some of the Mercedes limos and your pictures taking important people around. I understand that probably the food's pretty good if you're a member of very high up in the government and you have luxury items. First of all, do you think I'm correct, or the people who said that reported this, are they correct, number one? And number two, do you think the average North Korean, let's say an urban one who's, a little hipper than maybe folks up north in the country, do you think they're aware of this at all? Do you think they know how high on the hog their leaders are living?
I think that's a really interesting question. Your first question about the elite, I mean, I definitely saw that level of lifestyle for people who were living in Pyongyang. There were shops which sold luxury items, such as fancy watches and belts and jewelry and things where there would be people browsing and spending their US dollars, because foreign currency there is used rather than North Korean won itself. It's much more valuable and much more stable currency. And
Mr. and Mrs. Front Porch Pyongyang were not buying these things.
Well, that's the interesting thing. They may not have been buying them, but that's not to say they wouldn't necessarily know the value of them. It depends. I mean, everyone's
Oh,
experience is
sure.
going to be different, and
Sure.
within the countryside, particularly, life is very basic there.
Right.
But there are also shops there as well. And what I found really interesting was the fact that people were aware of certain brands, like Starbucks or Chanel, or Apple. They were aware of certain brands that were very, very desirable. I saw a car with, probably kind of like wouldn't be real, it'd be black market, Chanel covers over the head piece on the car seats. And even for someone to know what that is, in North Korea, which allegedly is so closed off, means that someone has learned that from somewhere, whether that's a piece of media or having left the country themselves or from someone else. They've learned that that is a desirable luxury item, and therefore it says something about them if they have it. So that was really interesting.
Do you think they know the elite is eating caviar and drinking French champagne? Or it's the only kind of champagne is French champagne?
It's a very good question, and that's something I would have loved to have asked people. Do you really buy into this?
Excuse me for interrupting, Lindsay. Did you go
okay.
to diplomatic events, diplomatic dinners where North Koreans were hosting, and did they put on the dog, as we say in America?
Oh yeah, yeah, the diplomatic events that they have there, it's quite interesting because North Korea has such a small number of diplomats. It was always the same people that would go to them, so you get to know everybody very well. It's a very small community, and we would eat with some of the North Korean, cultural ministers or whoever it was that was there, and there would be drinks and wine and things like that. And those items were available. There were imported goods that we could buy there, which they served there at those events. But in terms of the leaders themselves, again, that's something that I think I've read a lot about, of North Koreans discussing between themselves. Have you heard that? Do you
Really?
know that? That was not something anybody asked me. But again, I wouldn't have expected them to, because it would have posed a risk to them by asking me that.
Sure.
But you could always drop subtle things in. But I don't think it's a secret that Kim Jong-un has a lavish lifestyle, for those of us who are outside of the country. And you do wonder how much people inside really know, even when they look at a picture of him.
Except for a couple of restaurants that you went into, it seemed the closest relationship you could have were folks who were working on the compound, gardeners, your housekeeper, and people you saw regularly. But you write that and you couldn't stay in touch with them. You couldn't write them from Taipei to say, well, I'm now posted in Taipei, and here's what's going on here. They got a really tall building in the center of town. There's no relationships that can stick with locals.
No, totally. I think that is so jarring in a world where we're so connected. You and I are speaking across the world to each other.
Right.
There is nothing like that when it comes to North Korea. You cannot write a letter and trust that it won't be opened and it won't be intercepted in some way. And also, I wouldn't, how are you going to get someone's address if you can barely ask and get an answer when you ask someone who's in their family, for example? Why would they tell you where they live? I've asked North Korean friends that just out of interest, and they wouldn't tell me. They would only tell me what part of the city they lived in. They would never tell me what building, never mind their address. And so, yeah, you can't send emails, you can't call. And that's been the most difficult part about the whole experience, is, developing relationships with people and having a definite end, which I just don't think is like anywhere else in the world. And I know they're out there. I think about them every single day, what they are doing right now. Are they out at work? Are they having a good day? How are their children getting on at school? I think about them all the time, and all I'll ever be able to do is think about them unless something major changes. And the only thing I can compare it to is like a loved one passing away. You have to try and find peace with the situation, right, as difficult as that is to do. And it's like grieving a loss, but it's a loss that's still there. That person's still very much alive and living their life.
Let me quote you. This is you writing. I struggled with the loneliness that resulted from the lack of truthful human connection with local people, unquote. Sums it up.
Oh yeah, completely. It was really, really difficult. And for me it was one long, quite just constant stream of questioning everything. And I don't know, and I say in the book, I talk about my North Korean friends and I talk about, are they authentic relationships? Are they authentic friendships? I don't know the answer to that question, and readers will probably have their own views based on that as they go through the book. And then likewise, this book is an open question to go, what do you think of what you're looking at? If you had to question it again in different ways, how would that affect you? Because that's what I ended up having to do all the time. But the only thing I was able to do was to just trust my instincts. And my instincts told me that a lot of my friendships were genuine. And I have hope that they were.
You think you'll ever go back to North Korea?
That's again, like I think anyone who has been there would like to go back to see how it's changed for a start, because it does change a lot. The reason I would want to go back would be to see my friends, because at the end of the day, they're the most important part of the entire experience for me.
I'm
Sorry, on you go.
Oh, I probably shouldn't ask the diplomat's wife this, but do you think there'll ever be reunification? The two Koreas? I don't
know. I just don't know. I think it's a very difficult thing to navigate when you have two countries who are extremely different. And I that's not to say I don't have any hope. But on reunification, it's such a complicated thing. And I think if it were, I would quote my friend who said that if it does happen, it won't be within his lifetime.
Right.
So I think we'd have a long, long way to go before we're there.
I agree. You've been so generous with your time. I just do want to mention a couple of downsides you said of living there as a Westerner. No cash machines, unreliable healthcare, unreliable internet connections, and sometimes, as you mentioned earlier, mobile signals blocked. So was the internet down an hour a day or ever or once a week or?
And we had, so every international organization had internet, but it was just varied depending on how good it was, and it was pretty bad. I mean, you couldn't make Skype calls or video calls. You couldn't stream things. Basically, you could use it to browse the internet and read things, and that was pretty much it.
Where did you get your Western news from? From the internet? Could you get BBC? Was there a radio-free North Korea? I don't know.
I got my news from the internet, from reading BBC or CNN, for example, and then also we had international TV, which when I was able to watch things like CNN or BBC World News, Al Jazeera was on there, and a couple of others. But that was all.
No North Koreans had this.
No, they didn't. No, they wouldn't have had that. But within the compound and within other embassies and aid organisations, they had that as well. But that was all done through satellite. So that was interesting, because we would learn about a lot of events and things that North Korea had done, such as the missile tests, before the North Koreans knew about it, before it was broadcast in North Korean media, which was quite incredible. So we felt like we were one step ahead.
The book is called Like Nowhere Else. Excuse me, it's called North Korea Like Nowhere Else. The author is Lindsey Miller, who's been kind enough to join us today. Lindsay, I would encourage anybody who is as fascinated with North Korea. It's a fascinating place because we know so little about it. You've really opened a window for many of us. I certainly recommend picking up this book. It's called North Korea Like Nowhere Else. Lindsay, Lindsey, Lindsey Miller is the author. We reach her today in Taipei, where she is living with her husband, who's a British diplomat, excuse me. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's early in the morning for you. Thank you for getting up early, but
no problem.
I'm so glad you took those pictures and wrote that book.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Thank you. Yep. I think we cut her off. She's about to say something else. I will say something else. Thank you for joining us. Keep in mind, this was recorded September 15th, 2021. So keep that in mind as you, I didn't get to ask Lindsay about COVID. Actually, I wish I had. I know that North Koreans are sort of closed about that, and she may not know about it because she left in 2019. At any rate, thank you for joining me. We'll do it again in a couple of weeks. Meanwhile, take care. If you'd like to receive my every other week newsletter, it's sort of a gossipy thing on travel, what countries you can visit, what the rules are, great deals, interesting museums or hotels are opening or not opening. All you have to do is go to maxatours.com/newsletter, maxatours.com/newsletter, and just give me your name and your email. It's free, and I'll send that to you every 2 weeks, and you'll be the smartest guy in the block. All right, take care. Thank you for joining me today to get an inside glimpse on North Korea. See you in a couple of weeks.